A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 38, Descent of the Lion. The morning air of the capital hung fragile and brittle, weighted by the pungent, suffocating aroma of burning pine and the freezing, clinical chill of damp earth rising from the royal necropolis. A low, unnatural vibration, resembling the seismic shudder of some prehistoric titan, stagnated heavily across the gridiron of Pella. It bypassed the ordinary metrics of a populace in panic. This was a terror that curdled the blood in silence. A monumental column of golden dust, churned up by the flawlessly synchronized cadence of 1,000 heavy boots, ascended into the firmament like a deliberate, living cloud as the vanguard of Thebes crossed the threshold of the city gates. This was by no means a transient maritime cruise. It was an absolute manifestation of supremacy hegemonia, structured to systematically crush the psychological infrastructure of every Macedonian observer. The citizens of Pella, conceptually habituated to the unpolished, chaotic bravado of their own native cavalry, withdrew behind the fractures of their window shutters and atop their tiled roofs. They held their breath, a suffocating silence gripping the city. Mothers pressed palms over their infants' mouths to stifle any sudden cry. The apparatus tracking through their visual field was no mere collection of human combatants. It was the clinical operation of a singular, terrifying macroorganism, cast exclusively from bronze and absolute, unyielding discipline. The stone of the battlement was rough against Philippus' palms, biting into his skin as he leaned into the defensive shadow of the crenellations. Beside him, young General Italus loomed like a tethered bull, his breath coming in hot, ragged bursts that smelled of sour wine and stale garlic. But Philip remained utterly still. At 22, his body had learned the discipline of a statue, even as his mind raged, a chaotic storm of profound humiliation and intense mathematical fascination. "Look at them," a voice hissed in the dark, crowded chambers of his mind. "Look how effortlessly they violate our gates. They don't even look up at us. To them, we are already ghosts in our own capital." "The Athenians bartered us a solitary shield," Italus muttered. He leaned forward, violently expelling a thick spray of sour saliva onto the sun-baked, dust-choked flagstones below. His massive chest heaved with a claustrophobic, trapped rage, his heavy baritone grating with the primitive, gravelly friction of the Macedonian highland warlords. "But these Thebans, these overfed swine, have marched across our borders to permanently rivet a set of iron manacles around our wrists. Scan their posture, boy. Look at the tilt of their chins. They possess zero metrics of the guest. They navigate our gridiron exclusively with the cadence of the master." Atalus's fingers twitched toward the pommel of his broadsword, a useless, desperate reflex that made Philip tighten his jaw. An old man's anger, Philip thought, a cold flash of contempt cutting through his own dread. He wants to bleed on the stone to prove he is brave. He doesn't see that throwing our lives away fixes nothing. Philip, his slate gray pupils remained ruthlessly locked onto the courtyard below, entirely ignoring the older general's tirade. He was busy auditing the precise micro-movements of Pelopidas. The Theban commander was dismounting his massive gray stallion now, sliding from the saddle with an infuriating, casual grace that spoke of absolute comfort in a hostile land. Pelopidas radiated the effortless, almost divine certainty characteristic of a man who had systematically shattered the immortal myth of Sparta upon the bloody bedrock of Leuctra. Philip felt a bitter envy twist like a jagged shard of ice deep in his gut, tasting like ash at the back of his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear that flawless bronze armor from the man's back. But instead, he forced the emotion down, burying it deep, converting the burning heat of his shame into cold, structured data. He measured the distance between the horses, the angle of the Theban shields, the depth of their marching lines. "General Iphicrates instructed my mind in the cold geometry of the spear, sir," Philip whispered. The words were quiet, almost lost to the whistling wind of the ramparts, his jaw wired so tight the muscles bunched along his cheek. His gaze never blinked, tracing the deliberate, arrogant stride of Pelopidas across the courtyard. "He taught me how a weapon moves in space." Italus spun on him, his eyes wild and bloodshot, full of the terrifying desperation of a caged beast realizing the bars are real. He grabbed Philip by the heavy wool of his cloak, pulling the young prince close enough that Philip could see the broken veins in the old man's nose. "Then what formulation of knowledge does that Theban intend to carve into your flesh?" Vitalis demanded, his voice cracking with profound, jagged bitterness. "You are to be their hostage, boy. A trophy wrapped in royal silks. Do you think he invites you to his table to talk of philosophy?" Philip did not flinch from the old man's grip. Instead, his lips curled into a faint, dangerous smile, one entirely devoid of warmth, catching the sharp morning light like a bared blade. "Let them take me as a hostage," Philip's inner voice whispered with a terrifying, quiet serenity. "Let them lock me in their libraries and show me their grand designs. Every wall they build to keep me in will teach me how to tear theirs down." He thinks he's taking a prisoner. He's bringing a plague into his house. He gently but firmly pried Vitalis' heavy fingers off his cloak, smoothing the crumpled fabric with unhurried precision. When he looked up, his gray eyes were as empty and calculating as a winter sky. "He will instruct my intellect in the exact structural equation, General," Philip said, his voice dropping into a steady, chilling rhythm, "of how a bankrupt city-state, once the universal laughingstock of Greece, reorganizes its internal matrix to become the absolute undisputed sovereign of the known world. And once I have learned the equation, I will rewrite it." At the absolute zenith of the column, Pelopidas navigated his powerful gray mount, backed by the hyper-compressed mass of 1,000 Boeotian hoplites, marching in a dense, multi-layered vertical column, bathos. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of their marching vibrated through the flagstones, rising into the soles of the spectators' feet, rattling their teeth and settling like a physical weight inside their chests. A small child, clamping down frantically on the rough, faded hem of his mother's linen skirts, directed a trembling, pale finger toward the approaching wall of bronze. "Mother," the boy whispered, his voice cracking in unrefined terror, hot tears welling in his wide, reflecting eyes. "That is only one single man." The child's biological intuition was mathematically flawless. Every interlocking shield, every uniform span of the cornwood spear, and every individual countenance had been thoroughly melted down to constitute an interchangeable component of a singular entity. There were no faces here, there was only the beast. High above the street, huddled within the suffocating shadows of a terracotta-tiled rooftop, two brothers watched the terrifying machine unfold. Daedalus, an aging blacksmith whose body bore the scars of crude provincial skirmishes, gripped the wooden railing so hard the pine groaned. His breath was shallow, coming in ragged, terrified gasps. "We are insects to them," he thought, a cold, sickening sweat pooling beneath his tunic. "We fight like rabid dogs in the mud, screaming and hacking for an extra foot of pasture. But this is a mountain that walks. If King Perdiccas commands us to strike them, we will not be fighting men. We will be throwing ourselves into a grain mill." "Look at the length of those spears," Glaucus Daedalus rasped, his voice dropping to a panicked, urgent murmur. "They aren't even looking at us. They aren't looking for a fight because they know there isn't a force in Macedonia that can even dent their front rank." Beside him, his younger brother, Glaucus, did not move. He didn't even blink. His eyes, wide and glassy, completely bypassed the terror that paralyzed his brother. Instead, they shone with a dangerous, intoxicating awe. He watched the perfectly synchronized sway of the Theban cloaks, the flawless, rhythmic dip of the plumed helmets, and felt a strange electric thrill run down his spine. "It is beautiful," Glaucus thought, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, desperate longing. "It is perfect order. Look at the dignity of it. Our own warlords ride through the streets drunk, throwing mud and shouting insults. But these men, they carry the law on their shields. I want that. I want to be part of a thing that cannot be broken." "They aren't men," Daedalus Glaucus whispered, his voice hushed, reverent, as if he were standing before the altar of Zeus. "They are a god made of bronze. How can you look at them and only feel fear? Look at how the city humbles itself before them without them even drawing a sword." "Because I know what happens when a foot steps on an anthill, boy," Daedalus snapped back bitterly, his hand violently yanking his younger brother away from the lip of the roof. "And right now, we are the ants." Down in the suffocating press of the alleyways, an elderly weaver named Cassandra pulled her veil tight around her face. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the heavy bronze greaves track through the dirt. She had buried a husband and 2 sons to the chaotic, bloody raids of the Illyrians and the internal betrayals of the Macedonian court. She knew the smell of a dying kingdom. Let them come, she thought, a cynical, icy calm settling over her old bones. Theban, Athenian, Spartan, they all demand the same grain, the same silver, and the same blood of our sons. But these ones. She watched a young Boeotian hoplite step precisely over a puddle, his gaze locked rigidly ahead, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying serenity. These ones do not look like they have come to steal or harvest. They look like they have come to build a house over our graves and call it theirs. She looked up toward the battlements, spotting the distant, rigid silhouette of the young Prince Philip. God's help the boy, she thought, her fingers tightening around her prayer beads. He is to be the lamb sent to the slaughterhouse, or the wolf they accidentally let inside. Embedded deep within this moving mass marched the immortal 300 of the sacred band, Heracles, 150 pairs of intimate companions. Side by side, they locked eyes briefly, sharing silent vows of absolute devotion amid the dust. They had elevated their emotional bonds into a military matrix that completely bypassed the concepts of panic or mortality. To die for the man beside them was not a tragedy. It was the ultimate beautiful culmination of their love. Trailing this lethal engine of war moved an auxiliary support network of 80 specialists, including field medics, engineers, and supply logisticians, operating with identical, disturbing clinical efficiency. Their presence was the ultimate diagnostic sign of permanent occupation. No Macedonian lord, no matter how insulated by provincial pride, could fail to compute the message. Philip watched them, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, even as his face remained a mask of carved marble. This was no rapid plundering raid. It was an absolute iron framework designed to permanently anchor the sovereign will of Thebes to the soil of the north. And Philip, swallowing his pride, memorized every single link of the chain. The silence that descended upon Pella after the Theban arrival was not the peace of a city recovered, but the breath-holding stillness of a beast waiting for the knife. The siege, the famine, and the relentless grinding erosion of the Argead spirit had left the citizenry hollowed out. While Athens embraced the rising fervor of the Dionysiac cult with a calculated pageantry of civic theater, polishing the god into a patron of urban arts and structured catharsis, the fever taking hold in the deepest, scarred alleys of Pella was of a far more dangerous, untamed vintage. Here, in the shadow of the palace's political games, the worship was not a performance. It was a desperate, visceral reclamation. As the sun dipped behind the jagged spine of the mountains, the city's atmosphere curdled. The metallic tang of recent war and the suffocating scent of siege smoke were overridden by a heavy, cloying musk of crushed, fermenting grapes and rich, damp earth. It was an ancient tectonic rhythm, a pulse that had thrummed beneath the Macedonian soil long before the first marble stone of the palace was laid or the first Argead king claimed the throne. In the hidden, debris-strewn courtyards, the citizens of Pella were turning their backs on the shattered, impassive statues of the state gods, those silent observers of their hunger, and retreating into the primordial dark. For these people, Dionysus was no foreign import arriving by sea to refine their senses. He was the literal blood and bone of the Pierian earth. He was the wild, unchecked spirit of the timber that clung to the slopes of Mount Bermion, a god born of the crags and the cold mountain springs. This was a return to the oldest tradition in the region, a faith that defied the state's demand for order. Mythological accounts, whispered by elders and confirmed by the dark passages of Herodotus, placed the earliest Dionysiac myths, not in the manicured vineyards of the south, but directly in the heart of Macedonia. This god was a native terror, a deity of their own soil, who demanded not poems, but the complete dissolution of the self. As the torches flickered into life, the distinction became absolute. In Athens, Dionysus was a mirror held up to the city's intellect. In Pella, he was the fever that burned it away. To the Macedonians, he was the intoxicating madness of the woods, a divine force that refused to be managed by kings, treaties, or the cold clinical iron of the Theban occupiers. As the night deepened, the city began to sway to a beat that no general could command, a drumbeat of roots and rot, where the only order left to follow was the path of the vine. The ritual did not begin with a command but with a catalyst. In the suffocating, windowless cellar of a merchant's guild, 4 individuals stood at the center of a gathering crowd, the architects of the city's unraveling. There was Theban, a former priest of the state gods whose temples had been leveled by the usurper's siege, Alara, a mother whose sons had been lost at the hegemony, and the twin brothers Kestis and Lycan, who had worked the lumber yards until the Thebans seized them. They were not mere participants. They were the conduits of the pressure cooker that was Pella. Theban held a clay skin of unwatered, bitter wine, the last of a private stash. He did not drink to toast. He poured the contents over the stone floor, the sharp, fermented scent hitting the stagnant air like a physical blow. The gods of marble did not hear our prayers when the fire took our homes, Theban whispered, his voice gaining strength as it echoed off the damp walls. They did not look when we buried our children in the mud. But he is here. He is in the roots of the mountain. He is in the rot that makes the vine grow strong. Alara began to sway, her eyes fixed on a point only she could see. She started with a low, rhythmic humming, a vibration that seemed to originate from the earth itself. It was the sound of a woman who had run out of tears and found madness in their place. He does not offer us a shield, Alara cried out, her voice cracking into a frantic, high-pitched resonance. He offers us the dissolution of the pain. The twins, Kestis and Lycan, began to strike their palms against the stone walls, a hollow, thunderous cadence that synchronized the irregular, ragged breathing of the gathered citizens. The sound acted as a metronome for the collective anxiety of the room. As the tempo increased, the atmosphere grew electric, the air ionized by the sheer, desperate willpower of 100 starving people. The frenzy was not spontaneous, it was crafted. Theban and the twins knew the precise limit of the city's endurance. They took the physical exhaustion of the crowd, the aching joints, the hollow bellies, and repurposed it into a kinetic engine. Dance, Theban commanded, his voice now a roar. Dance until the memory of your hunger is burned away. Dance until you are no longer Pella's property, but the god's own breath. The frantic motion began. The participants were no longer distinct individuals. They were singular, thrashing organism. They spun until their vision blurred, discarding the rigid clinical world of the Theban occupiers for the liquid reality of the vine. It was a frantic, uncoordinated scramble, arms flailing, hair matted with sweat, teeth bared in expressions that hovered between agony and liberation. In the center, Alara collapsed, but she did not stop moving. She writhed on the floor, her body arching in a grotesque, beautiful mimicry of a mountain spring breaking through stone. "Save us!" a man screamed, not to the heavens, but to the darkness of the corners. "Intervene! Tear down the walls!" It was a total, absolute surrender of the conscious mind. By the time the wine ran out, the dancers were no longer aware of the city's debt, the Theban spears at the gates, or the crumbling dynasty. They were a weaponized madness. Watching from the darkness of the cellar stairs, Theban wiped the sweat from his brow and exchanged a look with the twins. They had succeeded. They had converted the suffocating stress of the last 3 weeks into a volatile, explosive energy. They had given the people their god, and in doing so, they had unleashed a force that no general's manual could predict or contain. The intervention had arrived, but it was not the salvation the king had prayed for. It was a fire that would burn the city down to its foundations. From the high, windswept gallery of the palace, Queen Eurydice watched the flickering torches of secret gatherings bloom across Pella, like a slow-spreading contagion. From this height, the people did not look like subjects. They looked like a swarm of insects animated by a singular, frantic impulse. She saw the way they moved, with a jerky, uncoordinated fervor, their bodies contorting in the torchlight as if their limbs were being yanked by invisible, subterranean threads. The rhythmic thud of a drum, or perhaps it was the beating of 100 bare feet against packed earth, vibrated through the stone beneath her boots, a low-frequency hum that set her teeth on edge. It was not a sound of celebration. It was a sound of abandonment. "They are finding their own salvation," Urno whispered beside her, her voice barely audible over the discordant, shrill wail of a flute rising from the slums below. "They think if they drink deep enough, they can drown out the sound of the Theban hooves." Eurydice tightened her grip on the cold stone railing until her knuckles turned the color of bone. She watched a circle of men and women spin, their heads thrown back to expose throats to the uncaring stars. their laughter rising in sharp, fractured bursts that sounded dangerously like sobbing. "They are not seeking salvation, Eurydice said, her voice a brittle, sharp anchor in the suffocating darkness. They are seeking an escape from the crushing weight of their own existence. It is an older, deeper hunger than the one gnawing at our bellies. They are shedding their humanity because humanity has become a burden they can no longer bear." Queen Gygia emerged from the velvet shadows of the colonnade, her movements as fluid and silent as a hunting cat. She leaned against the railing, her gaze dropping to the fires with a look of detached, almost scholarly appraisal. "They have always been his," Gygia said, her tone smooth and devoid of the terror that seemed to infect the very air. "The god of the mountain, the deity of the soil. When the walls feel like a tomb and the future is nothing but a list of rations, they return to the vine. It is the only freedom they have left, to be devoured by the wild." Eurydice turned to look at the second queen, her eyes cold and piercing. "It is madness, Gygia. It is the rebellion of the flesh against the order we are trying to desperately maintain." "Order is for those who believe in tomorrow, Eurydice," Gygia replied, her gaze drifting back to the fires, which now seemed to be consuming the darkness of the alleys. "But look at them. They have stopped believing in tomorrow. They have realized that the gods of the state have no power to stop the fall, so they turn to the god who promises that the fall itself is a kind of ecstasy." Eurydice watched a man in the street below fall to his knees, his hands clawing at the dust, his face twisted into an ecstatic mask like rictus of agony and delight. He was not praying, he was dissolving. "They dance because they know we cannot save them," Eurydice thought, a profound shiver of dread trailing down her spine. "They dance because the dynasty is crumbling, and they have finally understood that we are just as hollow as the statues they have shattered." She turned, her gaze sweeping over her daughter Euryno and the watchful, calculating Gygia. The men of the court, the generals and the priests, believed they held the power of the realm because they knelt before the altars of iron and war. But Eurydice knew the truth. Power was not only the ability to strike, it was the ability to command the spirit behind the strike. "Let them dance," Eurydice declared, her voice cold, steady, and devoid of the frantic energy below. She straightened her posture, the weight of the crown suddenly feeling like armor rather than a burden. "Let them lose themselves in the vine, if that is what they need to endure the night. We will not lose ourselves. We are the women of this house, the mother, the daughter, the keepers of the line. While they play at war, we shall hold the threads of fate. We will do what we must, just as they do what they must." Gygia let out a faint, enigmatic smile, the torchlight catching the predatory gleam in her eyes, while Euryno watched her mother with newfound awe. "The men worship the gods of battle," Eurydice continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the Theban encampments burned. "They believe that prayer is only found in the sacrifice of bulls and the clash of shields. They are fools. The true power of this dynasty rests here, in the shadows we inhabit. If they require us to nudge their hands, to whisper in their ears, to harden their hearts, then that is what we shall do. We will hold them to their duty, and we will ensure that when the dawn comes, the Argead name remains, even if we have to burn the world to see it through. Perhaps by dawn," Gygia added, her voice a silk-wrapped blade, "they will have found enough oblivion to stop caring that we are the ones who truly steer the fall." While the streets of Pella dissolved into a wine-soaked oblivion, the inner sanctum of the palace hosted a much colder, more rigid desperation. King Perdiccas stood at the absolute center of the shrine, his presence dominating the cramped, airless space. He was the focus, the axis upon which the entire frantic ritual turned, his shadow cast long and jagged against the altar by the flickering torchlight. He was the basileus, the male heir, the living link in a chain that was fraying under the weight of foreign boots. Behind him stood Philip, and further back, the other sons, the half-blood line of Amyntas, Archelaus, Aridaeus, and Menelaus. Here the air did not smell of fermenting grapes. It smelled of dry incense, polished bronze, and the stale dust of centuries. The cult of Heracles was the foundation of the Argead state, and Perdiccas was its trembling, living embodiment. If Dionysus was the god the people turned to when they wanted to die to the world, Heracles was the god Perdiccas had to become, or be consumed by. Inside the palace shrine, the air was thick with the scent of singed hair and ancient blood. High Priest Cleon stood before the altar of Heracles, his hands trembling as he reached toward the statue of the hero, a masterpiece of Parian marble draped in a heavy, symbolic lion's pelt. Beside the altar, a young, snow-white bull stood tethered, snorting at the metallic tang of fear. Queen Eurydice stood on one side of the altar, her face a pale, jagged mask of maternal terror. Her daughter, Euryno, clung to her robes, while Queen Gygia stood a few paces back, her presence as silent and unsettling as a shadow. As the priest chanted, a sharp, piercing memory cut through Eurydice's panic. She looked up at the stone features of the hero, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, she saw not the statue but her late husband. She remembered the nights Amyntas had spent in this very chamber, his posture rigid with the burden of a kingdom that would not bend to his will. He had worshipped here with a grim, quiet devotion, placing his palms against the base of the statue, as if trying to draw the marrow of the god into his own weary bones. He had always spoken to her of the propator, the founding father, with a reverence he showed no living soul. "Strength is not an inheritance, Eurydice," he had told her once, his voice echoing in the memory of this cold room. "It is a debt. We owe the hero our lives, and we pay it back in the iron we forge for our sons." "The Theban lion is at our gates," Cleon chanted, his voice a dissonant, desperate rasp that pulled Eurydice back to the suffocating present. "He comes to bleed the Argead line, to take our future into the belly of the beast. Oh, mighty ancestor! Slaughterer of the Nemean terror, you who shouldered the crushing weight of the world to save your kin, look upon your house now." Cleon stepped toward the bull, his ceremonial blade catching the firelight. With a practiced, violent motion, he drove the blade into the animal's throat. The beast let out a low, guttural groan, collapsing onto the altar base as a torrent of hot, crimson blood spilled over the stone. The rich, salty steam of the offering rose instantly, swirling into the rafters of the shrine. Perdiccas did not flinch. He stood motionless, the blood-soaked center of the ritual, his jaw set. "The people are dancing in the gutters," he said, his voice flat, cutting through the chanting. "They have found their god of the mountain. They mock the crown with every drumbeat. Tell me, priest, does our ancestor have an answer for us? Or am I to be the last generation to wear the lion's skin?" And if he is silent, Philip thought, his gaze hardening as he watched the dark blood pool around his brother's boots, then the lion's skin is nothing but a shroud. Let them pray to the stone if they must. I have learned to read the hunger in the Theban eyes, and I know that the god of the mountain does not offer a throne. He only offers the dirt. If the Argead name is to survive, it will not be through the mercy of a marble statue. It will be carved in iron in the very city that thinks it has claimed me. Eurydice stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the king's shoulder, a gesture that was half comfort and half constraint. "Let them dance, my king," she declared, her eyes cold and steady. "Let them do what they need to do, so that we may do what we need to do. While you stand here at the center, we are the ones holding the threads." Gygia stepped out of the shadows, her gaze fixed on the statue. "Thebes thinks they have found a hostage in Philip," she murmured, her voice silk-wrapped steel. "They think they are taking a boy to be molded in their image. They do not realize they are inviting a wolf into their own fold. They take the heir, and in doing so, they provide the crucible for his sharpening." Behind her, her sons stood in disciplined, watchful silence. They were there not to claim the light, but to anchor the shadow, ready to support their mother and serve their half-brothers, Perdiccas and Philip. They understood the grim hierarchy of the palace. They were the half-blood strength destined to be spent, so that the full bloodline might endure. Cleon turned to the king, his eyes burning with fanatical resolve, his hands stained dark by the bull's sacrifice. "The god does not provide comfort, my king. He provides conquest. If you seek divine intervention, do not ask him for mercy. Ask him to grant the blood of Heracles the strength to break the chains that the Theban and the Athenian have forged for us." Eurydice looked at the other women, her voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of sovereign duty. "The men worship the gods of battle, and they believe the king is the only one who prays. They are fools. We will whisper in your ears, Perdiccas, and we will harden your resolve. We will ensure that when the dawn comes, the Argead name remains, even if we have to burn the world to see it through." "Save your descent," Cleon cried, his voice bordering on a shriek, his arms smeared with the sacrifice. Save your city from the vultures of the south. Thebes comes to bleed the Argead line, to take our future into the belly of the beast. O mighty ancestor! Slaughter of the Nemean terror, you who shouldered the crushing weight of the world to save your kin. Look upon your house now. Look upon your descendant, Perdiccas, son of the throne. Thebes, the birthplace of the mighty Heracles, now reaches out to snatch the heir. Philip returns to his ancestors' cradle, but do not let the son of Heracles become their ritual sacrifice. Channel the might of your father, Zeus. Let the thunder of Olympus descend into this chamber. Give power to King Perdiccas and the young Philip. Let brothers rise, let them conquer, and let the Argead blood rule as the kings of Hellas. Suddenly, a memory struck Philip, vivid and cold as the steel he had clutched in the slaughter at the Helicman. It was the dream that had haunted his sleep in the immediate wake of that carnage, an ethereal, nightmarish vision that still pulsed behind his eyelids. In the spectral glow of that dream, he had stood before his ancestors, his father, Amyntas, and his brother Alexander. And looming behind them, a vast, crushing presence that silenced the very air, stood the mighty demigod, the progenitor of their bloodline, Heracles himself. Eurno watched the bull's lifeblood drain, her chest tight with unarticulated dread. "Mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Does he hear us? Or is the god as silent as the stone?" Cleon turned toward the women, his eyes burning with a fanatical, dangerous resolve. "He does not provide comfort, my queens. He provides conquest. If you seek divine intervention, do not ask him for mercy. Ask him to grant the blood of Heracles the strength to break the chains that the Theban and the Athenian have forged for us." Eurydice placed her hand over the priest's, her own touch steadying his frantic movement. She felt the cold reality of the room, the weight of a dying dynasty pressing down on their shoulders. "Ancestors," Eurydice prayed, her voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of sovereign duty. "I remember the vows made upon this altar. I remember the iron my husband poured into this house. If this line is to be the bedrock of this land, then your intervention is the only mortar that can hold it together. Do not let the Argead light be extinguished by the greed of foreigners. If you are the god of conquest, then show us the path through this ruin. If you are the god of endurance, show us how to survive the night." The shrine grew silent, save for the drip of blood onto the floor. In the flickering, chaotic light, the marble face of Heracles seemed to stare back at them, unmoved, inscrutable, a legacy of power that stood in mocking contrast to the fragile, trembling royals who sought to summon it. "He's waiting," Cleon whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He's waiting to see if we have the iron left to answer his call." Outside, the drums of the Dionysiac madness thundered on, a rhythmic mockery of the heroic destiny they were praying to restore. The king, the queens, and the princes stood in the dark, tethered to a god of iron and strength, while the city they ruled dissolved into the wild and making fever of the vine. In the heavy silence that followed the sacrifice, Philip turned to his mother, Eurydice. His voice was low, carrying the chilling clarity of a memory that had never truly left him. "I saw them," he murmured, his gaze drifting back to the altar. "After the slaughter at the Helicman, I dreamt of our ancestors. I saw Father Amyntas and I saw Alexander. And behind them, standing as the foundation of our very blood, was the mighty Heracles. He did not come to offer comfort. He answered the call the moment we shed this blood. He is here, Mother. He is already waiting." To be continued in episode 39, Scales of Hegemony, A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead Dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.